JavaScript has its perks and its best practices. Some things are best to avoid, and some practices make you a better coder. In this video, we look closer to 50 tips, from making your code easier to read to avoiding globals to performance tips. Ready, set, go! Stick to a strict coding style. Browsers are very forgiving when it comes to JavaScript syntax. But this is not an excuse to write bad code, even if browsers are able to digest it. A careless coding style will get back at you when you shift to another environment. That is, if coworkers don't get back at you for suffering first. Second, strictly use strict. Strict mode makes a lot of changes to how JavaScript runs, from obvious to subtle. And these ones you'll be most grateful for. With use strict, silent errors will now throw errors. Mistakes that you make that are difficult for JavaScript engine optimization will now be relieved. Your code might even work faster. In ES5, the strict mode is optional, but in ES6 is needed for many ES6 features. You can read the Mozilla reference on strict mode for more info. See the link below. Then third, linting. The linting tool for JavaScript is JSLint. It will give you a detailed report about the syntax warnings and their meaning. You can also use JSHint, a static code analysis tool. 4. Read code style guides. The most used and recommended code style guide for JavaScript is the Google Code Style Guide for JavaScript. You can also read idiomatic.js. 5. Avoid global variables. Minimize the use of global variables. Global variables are a terribly bad idea. The problem with global variables and functions is that they can be overwritten by other scripts. You can wrap the whole thing in an anonymous function or use an object literal. Then 6. Prioritize access to local variables. JavaScript first searches to see if a variable exists locally, then searches progressively in higher level of scope until global variables. Therefore, the local variables will be found faster. To define the current scope, precede each variable with let or const. This will prevent the lookup and also speed up the code. 7. Declarations on top. Put all the declarations on top of the script or a functions to get clearer code. You don't want to have declarations all over the code, and you want to reduce the possibility of redeclarations. 8. Initialize variables. Best practice would also be to initialize variables when you declare them. Declare and initialize at the beginning. 9. Make it understandable. IENA, PREAL TV would be a bad variable names. Also, new order if item is on stock and customer from Australia is not really readable. Imagine reading code with these variables. You want to make your code understandable with short and meaningful names. A variable name should make sense. Imagine yourself as an artist, a writer. You want your story easily to follow. Use a strict equal comparison. When you use equal, your variables will be converted to match types. 0 equals empty string will produce true, where 0 strict equal empty string will produce false. This is because strict equal operator forces a comparison of values and types. 11. Beware of automated type conversions. Because JavaScript is loosely typed, a variable can contain different data types. Also, a variable can change its data type. We can simply do this. With the second statement, variable text is converted from type string to a number. 12. Don't declare unnecessary variables. More variables, more memory space. For example, instead of writing this, you can write this. In the first case, we had 2 variables. With a little restructuring, we now have no variables. 13. Use parameter defaults. When you call a function and forget to pass a parameter to it, then the missing argument is set to undefined. In ES5, you needed to do this. ES6 introduces default parameters for the function. You can do this. It's a good habit to assign default values to arguments. 14. End your switches with defaults. It's a good practice to end your switch statements with a default, even if it does not seem so. So in the default should be probably some error handling, maybe an exception. 15. Eval is not your friend. Here is what Mozilla says about eval. Warning: executing JavaScript from a string is an enormous security risk. It is far too easy for a bad actor to run arbitrary code when you use eval. See the Never Use Eval article. No other comments needed. 16. Don't use new object. Use curly braces instead of new object. Use quotes instead of new string. Use 0 instead of new number. Use false instead of new boolean. Use square braces instead of new array. Use this instead of new regex. Use function expression instead of new function. 17. Comment your code, but only as much as needed, not more. 18. Use shorthand notation when it makes sense. Yes, shorthand notation makes your code super small. We all like that. But if you overdo it, then your code can become unreadable. Conditions are where I find it most useful. No need to write this when you can write this. And this little example can be simplified with a double pipe character. The price will have a value of 20 if the discount is undefined. See the link with more examples. 19. Have one function per task. Make your code modular. One function should not do everything. Sooner or later you'll be doing the same thing in several functions. Small, generic helper functions for one specific task are the way to go. Good code should be very easy to build upon without rewriting the code. 20. Learn about this and that. Is this really this, or is this something else entirely? Or is it undefined? This is the real question. See the link to this tutorial. 21. Learn about scopes. Understanding the variable scope in JavaScript is the only way. You don't want to have sleepless nights when your code behaves like an alien. The scope is the accessibility of the variable, functions and objects in some particular part of your code during runtime. In other words, scope determines the visibility of variables and other resources in areas of your code. See the link with a nice tutorial that can help you. 22. Use the fastest way to loop through variables. In JavaScript there are many ways to loop through an array. First way is a for loop. Other ways include for off loop, the for each method for arrays, map and filter. Also, loop through the array as the map and filter operations are being done. And there is also the while loop. The for loop is the fastest way, and caching the length make the loop perform better. Some browser engines have optimized the for loop without caching the length property. The while loop with decrementing index is approximately 1.5 times slower than the for loop. And using the for each loop is 10 times slower than the for loop, so it's probably better to avoid it, especially for large arrays. 23. Don't do too much nesting. Nesting too far can make your code super unreadable. The coder after you should not suffer when their code editor wraps long lines. Down here is a guide that will help you determine how deep is balanced nesting. 24. Problems with the DOM. Accessing DOM is slow. Manipulating, accessing and adding must be done in a smart way. 25. Use the best libraries and frameworks. With so many JavaScript libraries and frameworks, you can pick the best tool for you. React, Angular, Vue is the direction to look in. 26. Have efficient configuration and translation. Put all the configuration in one object. Some things are likely to change in time. Therefore, allow for configuration and translation. 27. Reduce access to variables and properties. When you do loops, don't read the length attribute of an array at every iteration. This means that every time the loop runs, JavaScript needs to read the length of an array. You can avoid that by storing the length value in a different variable. 28. Don't trust any data. Do you know what users do? They enter incorrect data all the time. And it is not because they're stupid. And it is not because they're stupid or evil and want to hack you. They could be just busy, distracted, or the instructions are confusing. You need to check the data. It needs to be clean and exactly what you need. 29. Use the power of ES6 arrow functions. To avoid some of the edge cases and trauma associated with this, ES6 gives us the array functions. Arrow functions bind this. 30. Use template literals. Template literals make working with strings so much easier than before. No more long string concatenation. To create a template literal, instead of using single quotes or double quotes, we can use backtick character. This will produce a new string and we can use it in any way we want. Let spread help you with the arrays. Spread allows an array to expand in places where 0+ arguments are expected. 32. Defer the loading of scripts. When loading a file, browser has to download the file, parse the content, and then convert it to machine code and run it. It's expensive. It's best to delay as much as possible. Therefore, put the script tag on the end of the file. Also use the defer attribute on the script tag to delay. 33. Save bytes by using minification. Minification of JavaScript will reduce the file size without changing the functionality of the file. 34. Avoid unwanted loops. Don't use nested loops if not required in order to keep the JavaScript linear. Also, you don't want your code to go through thousands of objects. This would make your code super slow. 35. Prefer map over a for loop. Benefits of using a map are immutability, scope isolation and reusability, cleaner code, and composability. Here is a little example of composability. Let's say we want to sum up the odd numbers in an array. Let's use a map and other iteration operators. We need to write this. But with a for loop, it would look like this. Now tell me, wouldn't it be foolish to believe coding is an art? Use proper event handlers. Reuse the depth of your call stack by proper use of event handlers. Also, if you don't keep track of them, they can execute repeatedly without your knowledge. Use RxJS for composing asynchronous and event-based programs. RxJS is a library for composing asynchronous and event-based programs by using observable sequences. This is called reactive programming. It is programming with asynchronous data streams. Systems built as reactive systems are more flexible, loosely coupled, and scalable. They are responsive, resilient, elastic, and message-driven. An observable is a representation of any set of values over any amount of time. Like data streams, events happen over time, and their payload contains some values. Observables are basically data streams that code waits for. In simple terms, in reactive programming, we don't program what is supposed to happen next, like linear execution of code. You execute code reactively. For example, you don't have to wait till all the data is in place, till every move event has already happened. But you can react to each chunk of data exactly when it happens. You react when something happens and you handle and modify the data that comes in. What you're basically doing is this. You'll be dealing with observable satellite types like observers, schedulers, and subjects, and operators like map, filter, reduce, every. You'll be handling asynchronous events as collections. Core benefits of using RxJS and reactive programming are that you produce values using pure functions. That means your code is less prone to errors. And you isolate the state. RxJS has a whole range of operators that help you control how the events flow through your observables. You can transform the values passed through your observables. Cache in the browser. There are two options for doing this. The first is to use JavaScript Cache API, which can be used by installing a service worker. A great resource to help you utilize the power of caching and progressive web apps are the Google Code Labs. The second way to cache in the browser is to use the HTTP protocol cache. Remove unused JavaScript. When you have an unresponsive web app on your hands, this would be the first thing to check. Code might have libraries that are there just because of legacy. Remove it ASAP. Also, some parts of the code might never be running. If you detect a functionality that is not being used by users, remove it altogether along with its associated JavaScript code. Avoid using too much memory. Anytime your code requests that the browser reserve new memory, the browser's garbage collector is executed and JavaScript is stopped. If this happens frequently, the page will work slowly. Get acquainted with the Rail model. Google's Rail model is a user-centric approach to think about performance goals. Rail takes into account the various contexts of user interaction on the site. Users want to see page load quickly, but it's not likely that all functions need to be available for the initial load of the page. If a user must perform a certain action in order for a function to be executed, it's possible to defer loading that function until after the initial page load. Avoid memory leaks. If a memory leak is ongoing, the loaded page will reserve more and more memory, eventually occupying all the available memory of the device and severely impact performance. You can use Chrome DevTools to find memory leaks. In Chrome DevTools, memory leaks can be analyzed by recording a timeline in the Performance tab. You can find out how much memory your page is currently using with the Chrome Task Manager. With timeline recordings, you can visualize memory usage over time. Heap snapshots will help you identify detached DOM trees. And with allocation timeline recordings, you can find out where a new memory is being allocated in your JS heap. Doing a memory leak, the loaded page will gradually occupy all the available memory of the device and severely affect the performance. 2. Use web workers for intensive tasks. Use web workers when you need to execute code that needs a lot of execution time. Web workers help you run scripts in the background threads. The worker thread can perform tasks without interfering with the user interface. Web workers were introduced to solve the potential performance issues. They can perform processor-intensive calculations without blocking the user interface thread. Use common programming practices. Beware of computational complexity. Always use the algorithm with the least computational complexity to solve the task with the optimal data structures. And simplify. You can rewrite the algorithm to get the same result with fewer calculations. And always avoid recursive calls. Regex is your friend. Regular expressions are super useful in extracting information from any text. They search for one or more matches of a specific search pattern. Here are a few examples of the most useful ones. The first one is trim spaces in a text. Then find any valid HTML tag and the corresponding closing tag in a text. Then find any valid hex color inside a text. And find a valid email. Then match a username with the length from 4 to 12, where it are letters, numbers and dashes. Match a password with minimal length 7 and at least one uppercase letter, at least one lowercase letter, at least one number, and at least one special character. Use search arrays. They are used to obtain a value based on another instead of using a switch case statement. Use Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a good performance tool for web pages. It helps you audit performance, accessibility, and search engine optimization. You can run Lighthouse in a Chrome DevTools, from the command line, or as a node module. You can also install it as a plugin in Chrome browser. Lighthouse is one of the best tools to analyze the performance of a web page. It helps you audit performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO. Use Google PageSpeed. Google PageSpeed is designed to help developers understand a website performance optimizations and areas for potential improvement. The components are built to identify faults in a website compliance with Google's Web Performance Best Practices. 49. Use JavaScript Navigation Timing API. The Navigation Timing API provides data that can be used to measure the performance of a website. You can use it to measure in detail what each part of your code takes from the programming itself. And now the last one, test your code. You'll be doing unit testing, integration testing, and user interface testing. When testing frontend is a good practice to separate UI from functionality, then whenever possible, test with a realistic and fully rendered component. And also watch how the content is served over the network. And one more tip, you should query HTML elements based on attributes that are unlikely to change. Here are some tools that you'll be using for testing: Jest, Cypress, Enzyme, Mocha, Chai, Jasmine, and React Testing Library. This is it. If you like this video, share it. You're also welcome to follow me here on YouTube. See you soon, bye bye, have a great day!